Greetings. Before today's episode, we have a very special note that we would like to read for one of our patrons.
And I quote, "Happy 1-year anniversary to my amazing husband, Xavier, or as we know him, X. Thank you for exemplifying the love of Christ in our marriage and giving me the grace and mercy I don't deserve. Your love for God and others makes me fall more in love with you every day, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to spend the rest of my life serving with you. You truly are an Ephesians 5 man. I love you more than words can describe, and I pray that God would bless us for many years to come. Love, Anna Marie."
Happy anniversary, Xavier and Anna Marie. And do you have any advice for the
Well,
couple?
people often ask me, how did you remain married for 17 and a half years? And the answer is simple: don't get a divorce.
There you go. And the family that plays Trinity Radio together stays together, something like that.
Welcome to another edition of Trinity Radio. I am Jonathan Pritchett, and along with me is Dr. Jim Chatham. He is the Dean of Trinity's School of Christ-Centered Counseling, and he will be with us today to talk about the problem of suffering. Stick around.
We got Dr. Braxton Hunter, pretty talented and well-known apologist, shared the stage with the William Lane Craigs, to the Mike Laconas, to all those guys. Jonathan Pritchett, Dr. Pritchett is here, and he is a New Testament guy, does a lot of stuff, a lot of podcasts, a lot of debates, so on and so forth.
You can go out of this room tonight and be a Christian apologist. Now, it may not be that you're able to give the answers, but you can be immediately when we're done here tonight, you can be an answer finder for people.
We need to stand up and tell men and more women, God is smarter than you. And there are consequences for all of these actions. So why don't you stop for a moment and think you don't know what's best for you compared to what God knows is best for you. And we're back. As I said, Dr. Jim Chatham, he is a dear friend of mine. I am so glad you're here with us, classing up the joint. I don't have to sit here with Dr. Hunter this time, thank God. Get a little bit of gravitas around here.
There you go.
Yes, you're actually our second guest. We had Dr. Harold Hunter, and I did a show with him talking about divorce, and today we were going to talk about, and that was very popular. It seems like whenever Braxton's gone, the ratings go up. So I expect this would be a good one. We wanted to talk about the problem of evil and the problem of suffering, because in apologetics we talk about the problem of evil, but we're solving philosophical conundrums like the logical problem of evil. Goes back to Epicurus. If God is all good and all loving, why is there evil? But what apologists don't recognize is when somebody's in the midst of suffering, what they don't want to hear is a philosophical argument that, God still exists even though he's letting this bad thing happen to you. I know that you talk about the problem of suffering. You teach, Braxton Hunter teaches the problem of evil, of course, from the philosophical perspective, but you teach it from the biblical counseling perspective. So talk a little bit about what is the key focused areas of that kind of course, and how do you approach it from a counseling, just a broad overview?
Okay, well, first, thank you for having me today. I'm honored to be a guest.
It's not that much of an honor, but
I cannot replace Dr. Braxton Hunter, but I've looked forward to today, and so I'm looking forward to our time together. I think probably number one, when you have an issue such as evil, here's an individual that seemingly has lived for the Lord, and they're following the Lord, and you think about the 73rd Psalm, and the psalmist thinks to himself, I almost gave up. And he starts talking about the events in his life. He wonders, he looks around, and he sees these individuals who are not living in any way for God. In fact, they're almost like individuals who go out and shake their fist in glory and almost mock God. And the psalmist thinks to himself, have I cleansed my heart in vain? Have I in some way sinned against God? Is my faith vain and empty? And what happens in that context is, and it can happen to any of us, is that when you face the pain, and then when you can't identify why, then your emotions and impulses kind of take over. Right. And so the psalmist, you can just read that, and you can see his mind racing. He's trying to discern, what is it that's wrong in my life? What's going on here? And then he paused, and that's always the key. when you pause. And here you are, you may have rapid cycling in your cognitions, in your memories. You may have emotions that each time a new thought pops into your mind, you have an emotional reaction. When I was a little child, many decades ago, we used to have these little things called Viewmasters. And what you do, you had these little projection devices, and you would put the little slide in there. It had various pictures on it, and you'd pop it.
Click it. And,
you'd
okay,
click
I know what
it,
you're
and you'd
talking about.
hold it up, and you'd look, and it would be anything from a national monument to whatever, But if I were to stand there and start clicking that rapidly, you'd go, stop, I can't see it. My eyes will not focus. Well, that's kind of what happens to us when we go through pain and evil. All of a sudden, we're racing. One of the first thoughts is, what did I do wrong? One of the second thoughts is, how do I get out of this? And then number 3 is a lot of times people have an improper view of Scripture. They'll think, now, wait a minute. If I'm a person of faith, shouldn't I be, like David and have the great victories? Or shouldn't I be like, one of the apostles when they're walking into the temple area and facing, their critics and all of this? But so often when people face the times of adversity, they think, well, my theology's wrong, or God's not consistent. And all these thoughts start racing through the mind, and none of them stay there long enough for you to come to grips with. So you're just basically at the mercy of thoughts that are often irrational, illogical. And if you could stop, you wouldn't normally think that way, but you're in survival mode.
Right. Well, and that's interesting, because when we're talking about the problem of evil from apologetics, we're talking about reason, we're talking about you might want to scoot just a hair closer to the mic. We're talking about reason, we're talking about logic, we're talking about why these things fail. But when somebody's actually in the midst of suffering, all you talked about was emotions and mind racing. Someone like me is ill-equipped to deal with that if all they know is, well, you should have faith in God because here's how we know that despite evil, God, that's not what they need.
No.
Right.
No.
And I think you can actually make things worse if you start giving them, well, you should have faith, and because here, the probability of God's existence based on prior arguments for God's existence proves that the problem of evil doesn't go through, because we have a free will theodicy and we have, reformed theodicy. We have all these theodicies, but they're not thinking about theodicy. They're thinking about, I'm in pain.
Yes.
And sometimes I think because people fancy themselves intellectuals, especially among apologists, but even pastors, the first thing that they want to do is they want to be rational, but which you should always be rational, but it's not so much compassion towards them as it is analytical, and you would say that's the worst thing you could do.
Well, I think number one is, you, as a Christian, you always want to be proactive in being sure that you're growing in the truth. I teach several biblical counseling courses here at Trinity, and in that setting, we talk about the sufficiency of God's Word, we talk about the presence of Christ, we talk about the power of His Spirit, and from my perspective, the ultimate change agents are the Spirit of the Lord and the Word of the Lord. But what happens is when you're in the midst of a trial, especially something that you don't have an answer for,
right,
then all of a sudden your mind is racing. And your first thing is, number one, how do I get out of this? How do I get out? I don't like the pain of this. I don't like what's happening to me. I don't like what's happening to my family. And, your first thing is survival. There's a part of the brain that reasons that way, and it has a good purpose. If the fight or flight mechanism is going and, you see an animal, a predator, it's good for that to kick in and have an adrenaline rush. But when you're in the midst of some type of continual crisis that happens almost suddenly, and then it continues, and then that part of your mind is just racing. And physically you don't feel well, emotionally you do not feel well, spiritually you're confused. And here you are, and all of those things are racing, and you're thinking to yourself, nothing seems right, nothing appears right. You're totally out of focus. And so going into your world from the cognitive rational side, I would say that you want to constantly be nurturing your heart and your mind in the Word of God, so that when the inevitable crisis comes, Jesus said in this world you will have tribulation. I'm amazed at the number of believers who are trying to find a way
To avoid it.
To avoid it at all costs.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. Well, I don't embrace it, but
Yeah.
you know, but to come back and to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe let's slow it down here. Let's stop. Okay, what's truth here? And you identify that truth. And the first one is, you know, what about the promises of God? What about the presence of God? And you pause. And rather than totally focusing on your circumstances, you get your bearings. You slow things down. So your biblical logic comes back. Your emotions are not absolutely dominating and shouting 1,000 messages almost a second at you.
Right.
And you have the physiological reactions going on, and you know you're irritated, you're agitated, you can't get comfortable, you can't sleep because man, everything's racing and everything is just processing 90 miles an hour, and your mind is racing toward what about the illness I have, what about the suffering I have, what about the person who wronged me, what about the person who wronged me 10 years ago, you know,
Right.
pops in the mind. So
Well, it's coming. Well, I recognize what you're saying in my own experience about 9 years ago when my father passed away.
Yeah.
Now, 9 years ago, I was already what you talked about. I had solid biblical grounding. I had the cognitive understanding about the apologetics for the problem of evil. And I agree with you that that's important to have. But when you're talking about the emotions, the mind racing stuff, my dad was my best friend. He was my rock in my life. And he didn't become that until after I got my rebellious teenage years out, and you know, he went from the dumbest person on the planet to the smartest person on the planet. And so we only had a few years in my 20s or so where we became really, really close, since the time we were kids.
Yeah.
But, you know, he got cancer, and I had to watch him die a slow death. And despite all of the head knowledge I had about, you know, there's still a good God in the midst of this evil. Watching him die like that, horrible.
Yes.
And all of that stuff that I had prepared in my mind intellectually, out the window. God, how could you do this? Why should I even think you're there if this is going to... I never thought that I would actually have that kind of reaction. I thought, well, when something happens, I'm the guy who's even... I'm above this. Yeah. No way. No matter how much you try to prepare for something like that, and I know this probably gets into your bereavement kind of stuff because you teach a whole course on that. But for me, and I'm wondering, will I actually have to experience this again? Like if I outlive my wife, God forbid, I hope that I go first. But it's like I know no matter how much I have grounding in this stuff, that happens to you.
it does.
And it happened to me. And none of the philosophical stuff brought me any comfort.
Yeah.
None of the, well, you know, God has a plan for everything, and, you know, you will grow from this. None of that helped.
Yes.
I mean, nothing really. It's time.
Yes.
And people just letting me vent seemed to do the trick for me. Because I was mad at God for taking my... I never thought for a million years I would ever be mad at God for taking my dad.
Yeah.
But I was, because, okay, I do believe that God exists, so it's your fault. You could have given him 10 more years. You could have given me 10 more years with him. You know, we just got so close. All of that stuff, and it's amazing that no matter... And I'm not the most intellectual person in the world, but I had all that stuff that we talk about a lot on this show with Braxton, apologetics and stuff, but at the personal level, it's just... So somebody like me, what do you do as from a biblical counseling standpoint? How do you address me when I'm mad?
Yeah.
You know? And I don't want to go to church.
Yeah.
I'd rather be the guy who shakes his fist at God and say, God, you're there. I know you're there. I wish I didn't believe in you because you're whatever for taking my... You know, that's where it's no longer an intellectual thing.
Right.
That's a real thing.
Yeah. Well, one, loss of attachment is one of the most significant triggers in life. And, you know, just a couple of examples. When parents lose a child, the divorce rate's about 80%. The marriage just cannot weather that loss of attachment. And then we start looking for blame, and then what I consider a great injustice. It doesn't matter what happens. The mother typically is the one who's blamed for the death of the child.
Really?
No matter what happens. That's not totally true in every situation, but to a large degree. And so what we have to do is loss of attachment, whether you lose someone to physical death. You know, pastors who are watching and listening to this will think about things like people they're dealing with in their church that are going through a divorce. Even pastors themselves, when someone leaves their church. I remember years ago when Promise Keepers was big on the American scene,
Right.
and I went to one of the conferences in Nashville. And John Maxwell, everybody knows John Maxwell. Here's this guy, and he's written all these things on leadership. And he was standing up there talking to pastors about their pain. And he started sobbing when he talked about one of his best friends leaving his church. And the best friend told him, the reason we're leaving your church is because we're not being fed by you any longer. And I watched John MacArthur be that vulnerable, talking about the loss of that friend, somebody he's with. So coming back on topic, the reality is when you lose somebody, you lose a relationship. It is a major pain event in a life. And so
and for Christians, it's a spiritual crisis.
It is a spiritual crisis as well. And then, so what you have to do there is, again, number one, you want to take care of yourself building up to that moment, because you talked about you knew the truth, you nurtured the truth, and eventually you came back to that.
Right.
But when the high uncertainty is there, the brokenness, the pain, it doesn't matter in those moments what you know in that second. The emotions are dominating. And so what you have to do is, like, oftentimes the loss of an attachment is an anxiety event as well. Like, if I'm going to lose my wife or my child or my dad, what else am I going to lose?
Right.
And that becomes very threatening to you. And so one of the things that you want to do is slow it down the best you can. Now, you may have to go out and take a lot of brisk walks to burn off the adrenaline, burn off the energy, but you have to find some ways to take care of yourself and slow it down. Two of the worst things you can do are stuff those feelings down. I mean, when they study counseling, one of the most valuable parts of counseling, one of the most effective techniques that a counselor uses, I don't care if you're talking biblical or Christian, the integrationist, or you're talking totally secular, the thing that the counselor has to do is be sure they listen carefully. Don't be glancing at your watch. Just listen. Establish the relationship. Prove to that person that you're available, that you're willing to connect with them. And then when you sense that, then as you vent it out, now you can say what you want to. You can vent it out. I'm angry with God. I'm angry with the doctor who didn't pick up on, the heart issue. I'm angry with whomever.
Yeah.
I might even be angry with the pastor because I pleaded with him to come over and talk to me about my situation, and he was going to get around to it, and he never did, and then boom, he or she left.
Oh, yeah.
And so, it really gets
Anyway, you can lash out. You will.
You're going to lash out. So you have to vent. And one other quick thing that I would encourage is you want to be wise who you lash out to. Somebody else might use it. But another way you can vent it out is to journal. Just start writing. Do not worry about grammatical concerns or anything. Just start writing. And if in those moments you have some very dark, vile thoughts, write them out. It's okay. Vent it out. You need to do that, because if you stuff it down, whether you repress it or suppress it, one, you're stuffing it down. The other one, you're stuffing it, but you don't realize it. Right. But whichever way you're doing there, it's about the worst thing you can do.
I think the Psalms actually give us a biblical model for this.
Absolutely.
God's big enough; He can handle your feelings, no matter how. Yeah. So I've always taken comfort in that. Now, I recall with my dad dying, being mad at God.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine losing a kid, though, for me to start to really question. That would probably trigger me worse than losing a parent, losing a child, especially if they're a young child. That might cause me to have a faith crisis as much as just an anger issue. So a loss of attachment, that would be probably more severe. So when you have those people with you, how long does it take people to, if you're in a counseling session, what's the normal time it takes for people? Is it just all different, or how long does it take for them to have established trust with you to where you can really start dealing with the issue and being productive in a counseling?
Well, I think one is you're thinking about, let's take for just a second a grief loss.
Yeah.
All right. So as a counselor, what you want to do is you want to begin assessing how close, what was the relationship between the person who's seeking my help and the person who passed away. If you're talking about a child, that really ramps it up. If you're talking about something that's a very, violent death, like if the child were the victim of crime, or someone operated a vehicle under an impaired condition, all of those things really ramp up the variables. And so what you want to do is, as quickly as you can, identify the variables. What's taking place here? How old is the deceased person? What was the relationship? What kind of loss is this for the person I'm talking to? All of these variables. And you start identifying those. And then as you identify those, then you start trying to find ways to connect with them. Now, I've never lost a child. We're fortunate. Yeah. We have 3 daughters, and we have grandchildren, and I love them to death, and I can't imagine losing any of them at that point. But for the benefit of the listeners, for 40 years I was a pastor, and I did lots and lots and lots of funerals for parents who lost young children. A lot of them, and I can still years later hear the anguish, the cry. But if I were to say to them, I know what you feel, you've instantly cut them off. Yeah. Because number one, I've never lost a child. I've been with a lot of families who've been through loss. I have been with parents when their child died in their arms. I've seen that. I've experienced that. I've stood over caskets with little bodies in them and somehow tried to make sense out of that with tears in my own eyes, trying to figure out how you work through that. And so, for me to say, those little cliches like, well, I know how you feel. No, you don't. Right. Or the other one that always gets me, well, I guess God needed another little angel. Oh, that one really gets under.
Don't say that.
Do not. The cliches are destructive.
Write that down.
And so what you want to do at that first point is be a very good listener. Do not tell them what they ought to be feeling. Because what you'll often do is, you shouldn't be angry. Well, what are they probably going to do? They're probably going to ramp up the anger just to show you. Don't you tell me what I can. That's right.
They're going to be angry at you now.
So your first role is to establish the connection with them. That's the first thing. Whether you're talking the secular models, it talks about up front establishing the relationship. In the biblical counseling model, it's referred to building involvement. Whichever way you go, if you don't connect with them, you may be after that one of the greatest counselors in the world, and what you have to say may be right on target, but they don't hear you.
Yeah,
and they're looking
first thing. Yeah, and I think a lot of us amateur church folks, when like pastors who probably aren't familiar with counseling, if they haven't taken any, they've probably burnt a lot of bridges right up front, not knowing those kinds of things, and so this is going to be helpful for them. And they should all take some kind of generic counseling course if you're going to be a pastor. But you've worn both hats. You've been a therapist, right? You're a licensed therapist.
Yes.
Well, you wear many hats. Professor, dean, licensed therapist, and, like you said, pastor for 40 years.
Yeah.
So I guess the congregants get the free version. But is there a difference in what you get as a licensed therapist from what you get in the local church?
Well, one, I'm glad you asked me that question. There's no national law for counselors. Every state has its own regulations, and this isn't anything to do with suffering, but just we might spare someone of some legal, ethical issues. You want to know your state laws, and not knowing the laws is not an excuse.
Right. Even for pastors who...
In some states, they govern pastoral counselors, and so you need to be aware. And it would be worth it to see an attorney, pay them a couple of $100 an hour just to learn, what is it you recommend that I do and not do? What do I have to report? And all those kinds of things. And we won't go into all that because I don't want to waste our time. But ignorance is not acceptable in a court of law. In some states, if a pastor betrays a confidence, even in a prayer session, hey, we need to pray for Mr. and Ms. Smith because their marriage is in trouble.
They can be liable.
They can be liable, and there can be serious legal consequences, for something like that. So pastors need to be aware of the state laws where they are. And it's interesting. The license that I have, the secular one that's governed by the American Psychological Association, says I cannot introduce faith. Now, it's interesting that I do referrals some for an organization most people are familiar with called Focus on the Family. So they require me to have this secular license that says I can't introduce faith in any form. Doesn't matter if you're talking Christian faith, Hindu, whatever you want to put in the blank, Islam, I cannot introduce those. However, the way we do it is that we, if you introduce it, I can tell you, I can talk about it, but you have to control it. And if you were to violate that, if I were to, then I could be liable for that. I could be, an ethical complaint. I haven't had that happen to me, but it could happen to you in that situation. So what I say is I can't introduce faith, but you can, okay?
Right.
Now, as a biblical counselor, and I always tell people up front, I can do the secular model or I can do the biblical model. And if I do the biblical model, then obviously we're going to be talking out of the Bible.
Right.
So, but whichever way I go, this part is still the same. I have to establish the relationship. They have to sense two things from me, that I connect with them and I'm really listening and I'm willing to express, empathy toward them and not, in some way treat them superficially or like, hey, I got 30 minutes, tell me what your problem is. Oh, here's all you got to do. Read these 4 verses every day. And, you cause more harm than good if you're going to do that. And
there's no prescription like that for
there's
this.
not. And so what I do, and then you may up front as you're gathering, if you sense that there may be moments you're quiet and you let them cry. There may be moments that and your job there is not to fix them. Your job there, your task, your calling is to connect with them and point them from a biblical perspective toward the person who ultimately gives them hope, who in that moment, you remember you shared this a little bit ago, you're thinking, where is he?
Right.
How did he let my dad die? How did he let my child die? Why am I being falsely accused? Why did I lose my career? And on and on it goes. Why do I have this pain?
Right.
And so what you have to do for that moment, you're connecting with them, but your ultimate goal is to point them back toward the hope that we have in Jesus without trying to guilt or shame them. Now, if they stay...
That's important.
Yes,
that's
very important.
Yeah, because in evangelical circles, there's a... I don't want to sound negative, but there's a lot of guilt peddling.
Definitely.
That can certainly go on.
The old phrase, you shouldn't be feeling that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and making you feel bad because you do have certain questions and you do have certain concerns and you will have some both anxiety and anger issues, and a lot of people want to. I guess when they're not experiencing it, they kind of almost demean those who are experiencing. And the worst thing about it is they think they're being helpful. Going back to the cliches. I did not want anyone to tell me that, that God is sovereign, has a plan in all this.
Yeah.
I knew that a week ago. I don't know that right now, and I don't think I care right now.
Yeah.
That's not the problem.
Yeah.
But you're a Sunday school teacher. You're a deacon in the church. Or in some cases, a pastor. You're this, that, and the other. You should not feel this way.
Yeah.
But all of us feel that way.
You do. And, we process basically one of 3 ways. Now, you can overlap, and I'm not trying to put everyone into one category. Some people process more in a behavioral or active way. This is the teenager who gets angry and punches a hole in the wall at the house, or somebody jumps in their car and drives off, or somebody physically assaults or starts destroying things. So some people, even grief, pain, anguish, they process physically. And one of the worst things they do is turn it on themselves. And when they turn it on themselves, that's the reason you're seeing today a 30% increase in the suicide rate in our country.
Yeah.
It's also why you're seeing a huge increase in what's called SI, self-injury. That's everything from cutting to whatever, self-cutting. And so some people process it kind of physically. Other people process emotionally. And so, and in that, they can either go really super sad, they really embrace, the victim mindset, woe is me, and I'm the only person who's ever felt this, and boy, the negativity and the depression can really dominate. But they're kind of processing it out, more emotionally. And then there's you, who processes it out cognitively or rationally.
Yeah.
And, if I'm having surgery, and I don't want my doctor processing any way except cognitively. I want him or she to be looking at my situation in a very, factual, objective way to be, working with this and resolving. It doesn't matter to me a whole lot about their bedside manner. If they can resolve my physical issue, that's what I'm looking for from them. But if I'm going through emotional pain, I don't need someone who's overly factual. I need somebody who'll connect with me where I am. And I've even seen situations with people who are experiencing deep grief. I remember years ago I had a good friend of mine who thought he didn't do well on his medical school exam, and he did, but he didn't think he did, and he went home and took his life. And a few days later, the results came back, and he would have made it. but it was too late. And I can remember my friend's father, that he wanted to go outside the home. It was like the house was closing in on him. He was claustrophobic. He was so threatened. His world had been turned upside down. And if you'd have tried to hug that man, he would have fought you tooth and nail. He didn't want anything to restrain or constrain him. And we just went out, and he walked. And as I said a few moments ago, it was ice cold out there. And he was completely, detached from his immediate circumstances. All he knew was his son, whom he loved and thought he would share with, and his son who was going to make the family look proud, and all of these kinds of things, he was gone. And he was a man of great faith. He rallied back, but there for a while, he was angry. He lashed out. He processed physically. He did go in and out with the emotional side, but if you would have said to him, you know what, you shouldn't feel this way. You should be thankful your son is at home with the Lord or whatever at that point, he would have shut you down. You would have had no connection. And yet when he was walking, he was just talking. And then he was breathing, and he was just processing the best he could, verbally and physically. And I think sometimes for those who are involved, whether you're a pastor or a pastoral counselor, or you're a biblical counselor, or you're an integrationist counselor. We have some people who do what they would say the best of both worlds. Whatever you're doing there, you have to connect. They have to know that there's a stability with you, that you identify with them, but you have a sense of direction here. You have a sense of pointing them. There's a wisdom, there's a confidence. I did not say an arrogance. I didn't say a pride. And our job is not per se to really fix them. It is to point them toward.
Right. The Holy Spirit fixes them, you know. But God uses means, and God uses us. And so for me, it's in a sense that I like to be active in local churches. More and more apologists should be active in their local churches. But a lot of pastors now, with the way programs set up, they're going to get these issues in their churches.
Definitely.
And if they are not prepared for this, and even people who, we have friends who go through loved ones, I can think of some of you saying, I have probably ruined those moments where they probably needed me to be a friend and I said something stupid, and I could think back of that happening where I was probably of no use for them because I didn't. It was more, let me step in and fix this and find some clever phrase to get things going. And that's the worst thing you can do. Yeah. The thing you need to do is be there and let them start. So I'm a pastor. Let's say I'm a local church pastor. You've got all types of things. Yeah. You had mentioned suicide is on the rise. Depression and anxiety seems to be on the rise. Mm-hmm. We're sitting here in Evansville, Indiana, and Evansville was at one point the 5th most miserable city in America.
Oh my!
Yeah, and
I noticed when I came into town, I felt I'm
right. Yeah, that's me. My perpetual bad mood. But yeah, we were the 5th most miserable city, and then we were the most obese until here recently. We're number 2, but we were which always surprised me because, sorry Evansville, but the food here is terrible. The local cuisine I stay at the chains. The local restaurants are awful here because I didn't know how they got so fat. But there's a lot. You hear a lot more about depression, and that we don't think of. Why is anything? Some people don't believe it exists in the counseling world anymore, especially in the Christian circles. Some people, it's a fake thing. But people out there really believe that they're depressed, and if you're around them, they are depressed, and they even talk about to the point that it gives a physical ache from their depression even. And some people say, well, that's all cognitive, or some people say that's demons, or which is weird if they're a Christian suffering from depression. It brings up a whole theological bag of worms, can Christians be demons? So make some sense of that.
All right. Well, first off, something you said a couple of moments ago about pastors. One of the things about a pastor is typically he's been there for a while. So he has already built a relationship. He already has this sense of connection. In a lot of ways, the people can predict when his jokes are coming, and they kind of tell his stories. there's merit in that.
Yeah.
The merit is that when he arrives at whatever the crisis point is, hospital, funeral home, nursing home, whatever, usually he already has some sense of connection there. Now, I know that there are a lot of times for pastors, sometimes they meet their church members in a moment of crisis, and the connection is not there. And that's where you really have to, really work at it and make sure you hear what's happening. And one of the best things you can ask them is, all right, tell me what's happened thus far. Let them tell the story.
Yeah.
But, it's I want to give that word of encouragement to pastors that oftentimes they already have a pretty good connection, with the individual. But a lot of them do not.
That's
Go
the
ahead.
first. Yeah, that's the first thing if that's not to me. And I think the larger the church, the more likely that's going to be.
Yes,
right.
right.
Hey, you were a pastor of a large church.
Yes.
And so, it's hard for you to know everybody in that kind of or have had a.
And I worked at it really hard.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure most do. I mean, people
Yeah.
always talk about large church pastors don't care about it. That's not.
But
true.
you know what?
Yeah.
I may have known a large percentage of the names, but I certainly didn't know what everyone was going through. And the other thing that I noticed was that there were people who would say, I went through a crisis, but I didn't want to bother you because I knew you already had so much on you.
Yeah.
And I think that churches, I know this is not a pastoral care type of discussion today, but I think that, a pastor can actually set up a system of equipping some people to do some of the counseling under his direction that takes a little bit of that off of him. Because if he has, really much more than, say, a couple of hundred people who are fairly active in the church, how can he meet all their needs? Whether you're talking about going to the hospital, the nursing home, and there's some guys who are listening to us today who do it very effectively.
Yeah.
And I salute them, man. My hat is off to them.
I don't do it effectively at all.
But, there has to be a sense of balance. A pastor can become drained. And at any point in time, you're either recharging your emotional, spiritual batteries, or you're draining them. And when pastors usually battle personal depression, I can usually say, okay, just give me your schedule over the last, you pick a period, like 2 weeks or so, and you find out. I mean, I talked earlier to a former pastor today who was talking about how many times recently he spoke in a given week, 13 times, and was talking about the number of funerals. And I felt a little down after listening to him, just a little bit. But the truth is, pastors need to take care of themselves. They really, truly do. That's not a luxury. It's not an accident. You can read these statistics, and they're a little unique. But some of the the hardest statistics indicate that only 5% of pastors who start out in their 20s in some type of formal educational setting make it to retirement as a pastor. 5%.
Wow.
Focus on the family, and there's some who go a little bit higher. The highest I've seen is 10%.
Yeah, so
90% of the children of pastors battle some form of depression or anxiety and seek help for it.
So self-care for pastors.
Self-care is critical. Now back to the depression.
The
depression thing,
I want this untangled. I want the mystery solved here.
Well, any time we have a loss, whether it's real or perceived, I may think I lost something I didn't.
Right.
But in that moment, it's real to me. And what you're going to see is you're going to see a sense of loss, and that's going to produce a downward, attitude.
And this isn't just loss of life. This is loss of anything.
This could be anything. This could be
these
your
are
job.
triggers for depression.
Well, today, those people, there's more research being done in the realm of counseling in terms of the physiological components. And even the early proponents of biblical counseling, who are well known, would tell you if somebody comes to you and presents as just chronically sad, they just don't have good days and all this, one of the first things you tell them to do is go get a checkup. You could have something wrong with you physically. And those researchers out there today, they're indicating that up to 50% of depression may be generated by physiological concerns.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's not even mental issues.
They're just people that, and then you add to it the contextual things that you're talking about, like the loss, whatever the loss. Then you add that to it. And the way a biblical counselor would approach that is that, let's suppose somebody has a lot of depression in their family line, just as an example. All right, so somebody has a propensity toward toward, say, depression.
This is assuming that it exists, because there's people who deny that it's a real medical condition, right?
Well,
within the biblical counseling world?
Well, actually, it would depend. Some people think that depression, the answer to depression is in the hope of Jesus Christ. But all of us have, weaknesses in our life. I have a really good friend, and he and I have had some great discussions about alcohol. Yeah. And, is it okay for a Christian to have drunkenness? The Bible's pretty clear about. Right. Some people really get into that discussion. And can you occasionally, like at family gatherings at Christmas, have something? He says he won't do it because he fears that he might be the person that when he takes that drink, that all of a sudden he wants more, and he's trapped. He's in an addictive cycle.
So for him, it would be a violation of conscience, which was ever of faith is of sin. So for him, it should be.
He shouldn't do it
anyway, right?
Yeah, and it's like for me, as you know, being my friend, I have a blood sugar issue.
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, there are certain things I can't partake of. I have to, I don't like doing that. And so I have to be very wise about it. So if I don't take care of my body, that I know that eating that is going to harm me. It's going to trigger more of my diabetic condition. So what I have to do is, you can eat it, it's fine.
Yeah.
But I can't because I'm not taking care of my body.
So physical issues are really what's driving 50% of depression?
That's what the researchers indicate.
Wow.
And you can do that and then add. Now, there are antidepressants that people can utilize in some situations, but I want to be very, very discerning. And I know some of the people, when I said that, the red flags went up, and I'm glad they did. And you always want to listen carefully, process it out, and I don't expect anyone to take me at carte blanche today. Right. They need to listen and then think it through and reason it through and battle through in prayer and discernment. I don't take any of that away.
But you're not one of those people that says this is a myth. That you're not really suffering.
No, I mean I look at personalities.
Yeah.
You and I will interact with a large group of people later tonight.
Yeah.
And in the course of that, you and I are going to meet introverts and we're going to meet extroverts. We're going to meet people that are going to say to us, I've been hurt in my church. Is there anything you can do to me? We're going to have other guys who are going to be in a euphoric moment, and they're going to want us to rejoice with them. And it may be somebody 10 seconds from the last guy we talked to.
Right.
And so
it happens every year.
Every year. And so
for those watching, it's Trinity graduation week, and we have a big banquet and the ceremony tomorrow. So, yeah.
So, but the thing is, everybody, as one of my buddies puts it, he says, we're all wired uniquely from the factory. Mm-hmm. And we are. And then you add to it our context, from our childhood to all of these kinds of things can really exacerbate these things. And even if a person has, let's suppose they do have a huge physiological tendency toward depression, that does not have to be deterministic. There are ways that you can work with that, and you go, you know what, I need to regulate things. If somebody's battling anxiety, whereas I might be able to, or you might be able to process several things in a moment. Sometimes I go through seasons in my life that there's so many things going on. I have to be very wise. My values have to rise to the top, and I have to go, I can't do that. I can do that, but I can't do that because I know I can't process that. And my warning flag for me, I know when I'm out of line, whether I'm a little saddened or a little bit anxious, I know that for me is the case when cynicism comes in. If I start seeing a person or people as an interruption, rather than an opportunity, I go, I'm overdrained. I need to back it off and recharge a little bit. And one of the things that does that for me is Christian music. Everybody can find their own way. I have friends who do all kinds of things. They hike. But it's something to reward yourself.
Well, you lead a biker gang, from what I understand.
Well, I did until the students who've had me in classes know that I was a Harley guy for a lot of years. Yeah. No tattoos, by the way. But I rode and had a lot of fun with it. But a little under a year ago, I sold the Harley. So I've been going through myself depression. No, I'm just kidding.
The loss of attachment. Yeah.
The loss of attachment. I even had a name for it. I'm going to spare the listeners.
See, I know you had a collection of motorcycle books. Are they still there?
I still have the books.
You walk by and it's a shrine now.
I still have the gear. I have the helmet, the boots, everything. The only thing I don't have is the bike.
Oh, man.
But the thing is that, yes, there are people that give in to a victim mindset and they take on a depression that's not legitimate. And when you start going out and manufacturing losses and, oh, woe is me, you know those people that no matter what happens in your life, they can always one-up you on theirs is worse in some way.
Yes, I know.
And so a lot of biblical counselors react to that, you know, by saying that's not real depression, and they're right. What that person is doing is acting like a victim and doing those sorts of things. So there are those people who they just feel like the way I'm going to attach with you is I'm just going to be sad, I'm going to be down, and woe is me. And, you know, every pastor listening to this recognizes probably several people in the congregation.
So it's just a way to get attention.
It's a way to get attention. And then when we do not allow the hope of the Lord to grip our lives and guide us beyond the sense of loss, that if God allows something to be taken from my life, however, whatever the cause behind that, I have to ultimately trust His character, which is He's always loving and He's always all-powerful. And those never contradict.
Yeah, but when I think about your classes that you teach here,
yeah,
okay, well, you teach problem suffering, which we've been talking about. You teach depression and anxiety.
I do.
Bereavement counseling.
Yeah.
All of these orbit the same very downer.
Yeah, they
issues.
do. You do.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody tells me, you know, my child died today and I'm just fine with it, you know.
Well, that's weird.
That's also if somebody told me that, my best guess would be, and again, we're not allowed to diagnose people from a distance, but you know, just kind of off the cuff here, the shock has hit them so bad, or you just hit one too.
Yeah.
Someone who obviously can't connect in any way with people in reality, and there are some people like that, by the way.
Sure.
The brain
but
waves.
But they're so deep in shock, it's like, well, I'm going to be okay with this because they're not feeling it yet, but
not
they might
yet.
feel it later.
But they may, and those people are at greatest risk because if you go through a sense of loss, the best thing to do is own it.
Yeah.
Figure out the best you can what's triggering this, and I want to respond in just a second and tell you there's a part of suffering that is probably the most challenging for those of us who try to provide counseling to people. And I'll mention that one in just a second. But what has to happen there is if they do not process it early, it's not a question of if you're going to process it or not. That's not the question. The question is when. And the sooner you do it, then you can understand what's causing your anger, what's causing the bargaining, what's causing, you know, the detachment, what's causing whatever. And see, another thing that people do in the grief cycle is they follow the Kubler-Ross model and they think what's going to happen there is everybody's going to go through it in the same way, and people don't.
People get onto us for saying big things without explaining. Explain that briefly.
Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist, and she did research with people who were faced with a terminal illness. Okay. And so she worked with people that were middle-aged and they had, you know, received a diagnosis of a terminal illness. And what did they do is they worked toward their death. And what people do, they don't understand. Her research was not focused toward the people who are left behind. It was focused toward the people who were struggling with their mortality.
Okay.
And so...
But people take her model and
apply it. Yeah, they'll say things like, all right, so Jonathan, when you left your dad, so, you know... Now, have you been angry? Okay, let me tell you. The next thing is you're going to go into some sort of negotiating, you know, bargaining. Right. And you may not.
Because that applies to the one who's dying, not to the one who's survived.
But not only that, even though her descriptive titles have merit, if I lose somebody and you lose someone, there'll be some similarities. Yeah. Shock, probably anger, probably bargaining, probably some form of general acceptance, and then we're going back. But we're gonna have some common, you know, themes in our life, but you're gonna go through them different from me. And it depends again on who the person is in relationship to you, what the meaning of the loss has on your own life, and all those kinds of things. So we go through it differently. You cannot put, even though they're common themes, you cannot put a person inside of just one. And I see well-meaning people. They're trying to help someone. Well, you've had enough of this phase. It's time to move on. Now, there's a little bit of truth in that, in the sense that if somebody's been angry now for over 6 or 8 months, and they still haven't moved on, and they're still angry and lashing out, they're fixated, and they need some help.
Yeah.
But, you know, you may be angry for 2 weeks. You might be angry for 2 months. I might be angry for a month and then come off of it. You know, it just varies. And so what you have to do, connecting so you can hear what they're saying. And the other thing is what they're not saying, what they're not acknowledging.
Right.
You know, you're listening for both.
You have to track that when you're helping somebody.
And the other thing you want to do is you want to track that and you want to watch how they're processing. Like if somebody's talking to you, and I'm still going to get back to that thing about the most difficult one to deal with, but if somebody's like really fidgety, like their hands are going, they have a lot of mannerisms, most likely they're threatened and they're processing physically. If they're just kind of sitting there and they're looking off into the darkness and, you know, they're probably a little more cognitive. They're trying to find truth in there and connect with it.
Right.
And you know, if they're curled up in a ball on the floor in the fetal position and just screaming out loud, that's pretty obvious. Yeah. That's an emotional processing. So that's where you're going to connect with them. You're going to start dealing with them in one of those realms. Now they're going to do all three of them, but they're going to have a predominant one. Yeah. They're going to have a predominant one. Now, I think that probably for a lot of pastors and counselors, the hardest one to deal with, here's suffering. And sometimes it's a sin matter. Sometimes it is a violation of a natural order, like if you don't take care of your body, the consequences that can come to that. Sometimes it can be persecution, you know, but you can go back and identify, why am I suffering here? Right. Whatever the suffering, whether it's physical, emotional, or whatever. But the one that gets you, and is when you don't know. It's a mystery. And the prime example of that is Job. He was a man who loved the Lord, and yet what was going on in heaven? There was conversations going on. Job didn't know that.
Right. He wasn't privy to the
and so here he is.
Consider your servant Job. He loves you and worships you because you give him all this stuff.
Yeah, you know? And then you got these well-meaning friends who come along, and his wife, and you know.
The worst people on the planet. Right?
So it's like there are times, this is tough. Yeah. But you may not know.
And you may never know.
And you may never, or maybe when you go to glory, I don't know. But when you go to glory, it won't matter anyway. Right. But see, that's the one. If you can somehow, even if it's sin in their lives, and they can say, well, the reason this is happening to me is because, even though they don't like it, they can go back and identify the trigger. It's the one, like the Job-like experience.
Where you have no idea what
you don't know. Yeah. And you may not know the trigger, but in that situation, even though you don't know what stirs the difficulty, what you can do is still the person who brings healing and hope is still the same person, and the word that brings the hope is still, the Word of God.
Yeah.
So those are our big words, immutable.
Right.
And I think that one of the things when I see people going through loss, one of the things we have to do, whatever our form of counseling, is that we want to be able to attach to them, learn as much as we can. You want the what's called the objective data, like who is this, how old are they, where do they live, these kinds of things, their spiritual condition. And then the so-called halo or subjective data, which is, their rate of speech, their eye contact, their mannerisms, all those kinds of things, because they're often more revealing than what they say.
Well, one last little bit before we wrap up here. Now, you said the toughest thing is not knowing the source.
You can't, yeah.
But I'm curious about, with a lot of people in the church, and if we're all honest with ourselves, we have besetting sin, right? Sometimes we are the cause of our own evil and suffering.
Absolutely.
Because of our sin. For some people, the sin is the one thing that they try to justify the most, so they don't have to let it go, even if it's a thing. I figured that even if it's the thing that's causing their grief and stuff. How will you deal with that? Because that's the one that I seem to find in people a lot, is the sin that's causing them the suffering that they try to justify and don't want to let go of, no matter how much everyone else can see it. Sometimes it's blatantly obvious, like you're having sex outside of wedlock and shacking up with so-and-so, and you're wondering why you're having all of these problems. And maybe your relationship,
spending more than you take in, and all that stuff.
All this stuff happens around orbiting this one thing that you can all point to and say, that's it. But it doesn't have to involve, not all of it. It could be gambling, it could be whatever. But there's somebody will always have some sort of idol. Yeah. And they'll justify the place of that idol. Yeah. So that to me seems like that would be, if the mystery item is the toughest thing, getting people to see the folly of their sin seems like that sometimes probably the second most difficult.
Well, I think what happens there with individuals is sometimes what people are doing often is they're self-medicating. Yeah. So
sin is self-medication sometimes.
Sometimes it is. And the reason that they sometimes have difficulty giving it up is because they fear giving up what they perceive to be their comfort. So their thought is, well, if I give up this relationship, who am I going to attach with? Right. This person understands me in a way that
if
my
I give
spouse
up this
doesn't.
bottle.
Our bottle. And then the one they often come up with is, you know, God wants me to be happy, doesn't he? And so I'm happy in, you know, taking the church funds and running off with somebody else, you know. And people will say that. We've all heard it. And the reality is this, is that as a counselor, you want to try to help the person see what's really taking place. Try to get them to measure out the consequences they're suffering. And in doing that, you know, you're trying to bring them to the point, guide them to say, you know what, if I don't trust God and His Word in this thing, it's a form of, you know, what you and I would call practical atheism. I don't believe God's adequate. And so if they continue to do that, then as a counselor, you have to be very guarded about something. And what you have to be guarded about is you do not want that person to become dependent upon you. And all of a sudden, if you're not careful, you're actually, you know, reinforcing the negative conduct. Because if you sit there with them and he keeps talking, or she keeps talking over and over about whatever their self-medication is, and you're listening, and you know, and does that not really work? And all this, boy, they're getting some kind of feedback from talking about that over and over
almost
and over.
Validation from
Bingo.
you. That's
Bingo.
You can't be that.
Yeah, bingo. And by the
but you can't break the relationship either, though, by just rebuke. Either.
No, you cannot.
This is like the trickiest thing in the world.
And so what you want to do is you want to say, okay, I think we understand what's going on here. And I've shown you what it says wherever your source, the Bible, this is what it says about whatever your self-medication is. If you continue this way, you and I have identified the consequences. You know,
right.
It's at this point, I'll support you if you want to continue to move in the right direction. You can touch base with me wherever, but let me tell you what we will not do anymore. We will not simply sit here and go through this story over and over, because all of a sudden you're unwittingly validating. They're getting a charge out of it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and sometimes the most loving thing we can do is say, this is what it says. And I mean, if you want the consummate example of that, the Lord says, you know, unless you turn to my Son in faith, what happens to you eternally? Right. You know, so there's a very clear, you know, boundary there. And I would encourage anybody who's considering counseling, you know, always make sure you're not doing this to glorify yourself. This isn't about your sense of self-fulfillment or meeting unmet needs in your own life. Your goal in the biblical counseling realm is to help somebody who's hurting and is in some form of darkness or bondage to find the answers, the solution. It's to work toward the victory that God wants him to know. And even for the secularist, and, you know, again, the disclosure, I have secular credentials as well, that even there, our goal is not to keep people where they just depend on us for, you know, the next 30 years so you have a guaranteed income from your patient base or something like that. Your goal is to help them move beyond where they are into a productive, meaningful life. And everybody goes through ups and everybody goes through downs. Everybody goes through that. I mean, you look at Spurgeon, who battled depression, and yet he's one of the most anointed, you know, pulpiteers, celebrated preachers of all time. And a lot of people don't know. There are a lot of people in leadership roles in Christendom today who struggle with, you know, particularly on Mondays when they've expended themselves so deeply and poured out so much of their energy. How many pastors want to resign on Monday morning? You know, so yeah. But you know, there is a victory in the person of Jesus Christ and in the power of His Spirit. And so I hope that pastors will explore ways that they can build a solid counseling ministry within their local churches. If you have a really small church, maybe some guys could go together and work together to provide that. But ways that you can provide help, because people are going to try to find an answer. You're going to make sure you give them the right answer. And you've got to have something in place for them to turn to, and a place where they can, you know, explore their issues and find the ultimate answers.
Amen.
You know, now, one quick thing, there's a lot of subjectivity in counseling. Yeah. So some guys will, you know, like you said, and see, this is one of the, well, let's do it and I'll tell you about Jay Adams, you know, the founder.
Right.
Did he say there was no such thing as depression? What he actually said was, you can have sense of loss and sadness. If that's the case, go see your doctor. Make sure we don't have a physiological issue, okay? Once we eliminate that, because, I mean, it can be, you know, And blood work will show that and all of that. You know, chemical imbalances or whatever. But once you identify that, then what you want to do is, even if you have a tendency toward it, there are biblical ways you can work on it and find, you know, the answers that you're supposed to know.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So
what I know of Jay Adams is not very flattering. I've never read Competent to Counsel, but I know that one of
you ought to get the book. It's worth about $120 right now.
Well, Braxton's got a copy, and when he quoted a copy where Jay Adams, and I don't want to go down this rabbit trail, but all I know of Jay Adams' book is what Braxton quoted from it, where he said, "Never tell a counselee that Jesus died for them because you don't know if they're one of the elect." And that's a whole other it's on page 92 of his copy, so that's always a weird thing. I know that the Jay Adams and the whole biblical counseling model, primarily in the Reformed tradition, the integration is everyone else kind of accepts it. So there's a lot of interesting debates there. We won't go into those here. But thank you so much for being here. If you are interested, pastors out there, this is your man. He teaches biblical counseling courses here at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. If you like what you heard, you can enroll. You can audit a course and learn something. I've said this for years that I've known you, that I am eventually going to start auditing all of your courses because I know nothing about this stuff. But I think it's especially good for our audience who thinks more in the philosophical, apologetic problem of evil. But there's a whole other not philosophical aspect, but a human, a human dimension to suffering, because suffering actually happens to real people and people that we all know and love, and ourselves even. So
absolutely,
it's been wonderful shedding some light that we could never shed with Braxton sitting here and talking. So thank you so much, and also go to our website, www.Trinitysem.edu, if you would like to enroll into courses, or if you'd like to audit some of the courses. His courses are obviously probably better than mine because he's so much wiser. But we hope you enjoyed this program, and we will see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me today.
God bless.
If you would like more content, click here and keep watching Bible studies. Click up here. And finally, we want you to subscribe. We need more subscribers, so click here.